Growing up in the United States, I was always inspired by stories of the American Civil Rights Movement, inspired by the character, inspired by the moral clarity, inspired by the sacrifice, and inspired by the determination of everyday men, women, and children. Names that we know and names that we don't know, leaders and supporters of the civil rights movement, such as Dr. Martin Luther King and Thurgood Marshall, Diane Nash, Bob Moses, and many others, too many to name. But one of the stories that I always found to be most inspirational growing up was that of Mrs. Rosa Parks. Now, we generally know the story of Mrs. Parks. She earned international acclaim for refusing to give up her seat on a Montgomery, Alabama bus in 1955. As a result of her stand on the bus that day, Mrs. Parks was escorted off of the bus, she was arrested, and she was booked. An incident that would spark outrage in the Montgomery, Alabama community, and ultimately would lead to a 381-day bus boycott where men, women, and children who depended on the bus to go to work, to go to school, to go to church, to visit family and friends. Ultimately, they would decide not to ride the bus, to carpool with each other, and in some cases, simply to walk. As a result of that 381-day bus boycott, in addition to legal action that was taken in Montgomery, Alabama at the time, the regime of bus segregation in Montgomery, Alabama collapsed. In addition to helping to bring an end to bus segregation in Montgomery, Alabama at the time, Mrs. Parks' stand would also help to introduce to the world a young and relatively unknown Baptist preacher by the name of Martin Luther King, who took on the role as spokesperson and strategist for the boycott movement in Montgomery. Mrs. Parks would eventually go on to become one of the most distinguished and awarded and rewarded citizens in American history. Mrs. Parks would receive our nation's highest honors, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the Congressional Gold Medal. She would have a postage stamp issued in her honor. And upon her death, Mrs. Parks would become only the second person of color and the first woman in United States history to lie in honor in the rotunda of the United States Capitol building. But the more I learned about Rosa Parks, the more I read about Rosa Parks, and considering that we're approaching the 60th anniversary of her stand in Montgomery, Alabama, it made me wonder what else happened that day. See, when we tell the story of Mrs. Parks' stand that day, we tell it in a way where it seems to imply that only Mrs. Parks and the driver were on the bus that day. Well, who else was on the bus? What else did they do? We know the role that Mrs. Parks played, but what is the role that the others played on the bus that day? So I wondered if you would indulge me just a few minutes to just speak about what occurred on the bus that day in Montgomery, Alabama. Now, I have to give the general caveat that I'm no historian, but historians have been able to piece together a pretty compelling sequence of events that illuminates what occurred on December 1st, 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama. Now, we know that after a long day of work, Mrs. Parks went to the store to consider purchasing a heating pad to help with her aching shoulder. Ultimately, she decided against buying the heating pad because she figured she couldn't afford it. So Mrs. Parks made her way out to the street to get the next bus on the Cleveland Avenue bus line, which would take her approximately 15 minutes home to her family. As the bus arrived, bus number 2857 pulled up. Mrs. Parks grabbed her bags, and she made her way onto the bus. But she was a bit flustered. And she was flustered as she boarded the bus, which means she did not notice who was driving the bus that day. Now, this is important because the person driving the bus that day was none other than a Mr. James Blake. Now, Mrs. Parks and Mr. Blake had a history. More than 10 years before that day, Mr. Blake tried forcibly to remove Mrs. Parks from a bus. And from that day, she vowed that never again would she ride on a bus driven by that man. And after that day, she would say, had she noticed that Mr. Blake was driving the bus, she would have waited for the next one. But she made her way onto the bus. She took out her 10-cent fare. She paid her fare. And she scanned the bus to look for a place to sit. And she would eventually sit in a seat in a row behind what was traditionally understood as the whites-only section of the bus. Now, Mrs. Parks and historians would clarify later on that Mrs. Parks never actually sat in the whites-only section of the bus. She sat in a row immediately behind that section. So Mrs. Parks makes her way onto the bus, she sits down, and the bus continues its ride throughout town. Now, the bus wasn't full when Mrs. Parks sat on it, but as it made several stops and led on more passengers, eventually every seat was taken on the bus. Eventually, a man who we don't know much about was standing behind the bus driver, Mr. Blake, compelling Mr. Blake to look back to Mrs. Parks and the 3 other African Americans sitting in her row, and he said, "I need those front seats." Mrs. Parks and the 3 others that were sitting in the row with her didn't move. That angered Mr. Blake, and he looked back again and said, "Y'all make it light on yourselves and give me those seats." Mrs. Parks would later say that the 3 people sitting in the same row with her reluctantly stood up and moved to the back of the bus. Not only did Mrs. Parks not stand up, but she did something that many times we don't acknowledge in her story. She slid over. So Mrs. Parks stayed in the same row, but slid over 1 seat over to indicate that she was not going to stand up. Now, of course, Mr. Blake wasn't pleased about this. The bus driver challenged Mrs. Parks directly. And keep in mind that in Montgomery, Alabama in 1955, bus drivers had police powers, and in fact, they were armed. So Mr. Blake walks back to where Mrs. Parks is, and he asks her, "Are you going to stand up?" To which she replies simply, "No." And she indicated that she didn't think it was fair that people who paid the same fare that she paid would get her seat and she'd be forced to stand. So then Mr. Blake said to her, "Well, I'm going to have you arrested." To which Mrs. Parks simply said, "You may do that." And that's exactly what Mr. Blake did that day. He departed the bus, he called his supervisor, and ultimately he summoned 2 police officers who responded to the call that day. One of the police officers stepped onto the bus, both of them stepped onto the bus, and one of them asked Mrs. Parks directly, "Why didn't you stand up when you were instructed to do so?" Mrs. Parks responded with a quote that is iconic in the civil rights movement. And what she said was, "Why do you all push us around?" The police officer said, "Well, I don't know, but the law's the law, and you're under arrest." The 2 police officers escorted Mrs. Parks off the bus that day, with one of the police officers carrying her pocketbook and the other police officer carrying her shopping bag. And the rest, of course, is history. Now, why do you all push us around? It's a quote that sometimes is slightly altered, but the meaning is the same. Why do you all push us around? In the civil rights movement, the picture that you see here, this is not the same incident as Mrs. Parks, but it is representative of people being pushed around during the civil rights movement. And it raises a very important question because maybe people aren't pushed around the same way as they were back then. Maybe it doesn't look like this now. But the fact of the matter is, and what we have to confront is that injustices still exist and people are still being pushed around. In a world where people can still condemn you for the color of your skin and judge you based on the God you serve or the God you don't serve, injustices still exist. People are still being pushed around. In a world where some people still refuse to see women as equal partners and leaders at home, in business, and in society, Injustices still exist. People are still being pushed around. In a world where people can log on to blogs and social media sites anonymously and post hate and lies and bully and say you're too fat or too skinny or too white or too black, injustices still exist. People are still being pushed around. Now the question is, what role were the people playing on the bus that day? It wasn't just Miss Parks. It wasn't just Mrs. Parks and the bus driver. It wasn't just Mrs. Parks and the police officer. There were other people on the bus that day, and I wonder if you journey with me onto the bus just to talk a little bit more about who some of these people were and what they did during this incident between Mrs. Parks and Mr. Blake. Now, obviously, please use your imagination. We are now looking into bus number 2857, and I have to give the general caveat, this is an American bus, so the driver is on the other side of the bus. This will be a very confusing story if I don't start off with that. So, who are some of the characters that we talked about on the bus that day? The first is Mr. Blake, the bus driver. So, to be fair, Mr. Blake didn't invent segregation. He didn't write the laws that dictated where blacks and whites should sit on the bus. He wasn't behind that. He wasn't responsible for that. But on the bus that day, during that incident, during that episode, Mr. Blake is the person who is causing the injustice. We have people sitting in the front of the bus, what was traditionally recognized as the whites-only section of the bus. Now, historians would tell us there's no record of anyone in the front of the bus actually saying anything. There's no record of them saying anything rude to Mrs. Parks. Nobody made any comments. In fact, all we can piece together and all we can surmise is that the people sitting in the front of the bus just watched. And in fact, that's the role that they played in all of this. They watched an injustice. And then we have the passenger who boarded the bus, the 37th passenger who came aboard. Now, again, he didn't say anything. But his presence set into motion Mr. Blake asking Mrs. Parks and the three others in her row to give up their seat. Now, people would say, as with the people sitting in the front of the bus, historians would tell us that they don't know much about this passenger. They don't know much about this man. They know that he was white and they know that he was there. But he actually never said anything. And in fact, Mrs. Parks says she doesn't remember him. But he would set in motion a cascading series of events that obviously would lead to the boycott. So in this instance, he is standing by to take the seats that Mrs. Parks and the other three are vacating in their row. So he is standing by to benefit from an injustice. Then we have the people that are sitting toward the back of the bus in the section that is traditionally referred to as the blacks-only section. Now, in a way, these people are in the same boat as Mrs. Parks. They didn't come up with segregation, but they were subjected to it. They were subjected to the same humiliations, the same second-class citizenship of being forced to sit in the back of the bus. In fact, sometimes when they boarded the bus through the front door to pay their fare, they were told to get off the bus and come back through the back door. So in this instance, when all of this is happening with Mrs. Parks, the people sitting in the back of the bus, they are enduring an injustice. Now that leaves the role that Mrs. Parks played. Because if we have people who are causing injustice, watching injustice, benefiting from injustice, and enduring injustice, that leaves the role for her to reject injustice. And we see the people standing up, we see Mrs. Parks sliding over, and we see her sitting with dignity and defiance, rejecting injustice. Now, let's talk a little bit about these rules again. When we find ourselves in injustice in life, it might not be on a grand scale as Mrs. Parks, but every day you will find yourself in a situation where there are some type of injustices around you, and we have to ask ourselves, what role are we playing? Are we the one who causes the injustice? Are we the ones that inflict pain or suffering on other people, that put them down? Or are we people who watch injustice? We never actually say anything about it. We might think it's wrong, but we don't say so. We let it play out. We let other people be subjected to it, but we never actually say anything or do anything about it. Or maybe we're people who benefit from injustice. Now, this is an interesting category because sometimes we'll let someone else get picked on. We'll let another group get run down because that means they're not running us down or running down our group. So we benefit from the fact that someone else is suffering an injustice. Or maybe we're the ones enduring it. Maybe we are the people who are being denigrated, who are being put down, who are being left out. And that leaves the role, the most important role, that we are all called to take the Rosa role, and that is the people who reject injustice. Now I've got to be honest with you. Playing the Rosa role, rejecting injustice in life and society, it's not as glamorous or as glorious as it might sound. So Mrs. Parks would go on to receive accolades and awards and honors, but she paid a price for what she did that day. Not too long after her stand on December 1st, 1955, Mrs. Parks would ultimately lose her full-time job. And she would have a hard time maintaining gainful employment in Montgomery, Alabama, to the point that she had to relocate from Montgomery to Detroit, Michigan, just to be able to earn a living. Now, the role that Mrs. Parks played of rejecting injustice, it's not glamorous, but it's critically important. And it's a role that we're all called to play in our own lives, in our own communities, in our own schools, in our own neighborhoods. See, the story of Mrs. Parks, and in fact of the greater civil rights movement altogether, it forever dispels the myth that in order to bring change, in order to reject injustice, in order to be the moral voice for your society, it rejects the myth that in order to do that, you need to be rich or popular or have a lot of Facebook fans or have a lot of friends at school or sit at the cool table at school. It rejects that myth. Because all Mrs. Parks had that day on bus number 2857 on December 1st, 1955 was determination, principles, and courage. And it turned out that's all she really needed. Now think about this. In a bus ride that did not take 15 minutes, Mrs. Parks changed her community, the life of her people, and the world. I ask you, what change can you bring in 15 minutes? The role, again, it's not a glamorous one. And again, it's one that we're all called to play. But you know what? To be completely honest with you, most of us will never be called to board bus number 2857 and do what she did that day. Actually, in fact, none of us will be called onto bus 2857 because that bus is in a museum right now. We might never be called to do something as grand and as glorious as Mrs. Parks did. No, maybe the injustice that we're called to fight is on a more local level. Maybe it's in our interactions on a day-to-day basis. Maybe the injustice that we're called to fight, the Rosa role that we're called to play is with our friends, or it's at home, or it's at our jobs, or it's at school. See, we probably find ourselves in situations on any given day where we hear something, we hear a joke, a remark, somebody putting down another group, and you know what, we might even think to ourselves, that's not right. We might even believe that's not right. But it's not enough to think it. It's not enough to believe it. We actually have to speak out and say, that's not right. The interesting thing about the civil rights movement and what it teaches us is that in fighting injustice, we can't wait for someone else to act. Imagine if Mrs. Parks had said on that day, you know what, I'm going to wait for somebody else to say something. When Mr. Blake looked back at them and said, hey, the four of you get up, give me those seats, maybe Mrs. Parks just gets up with the other three and walks to the back of the bus and scans the bus to see, you know what, somebody else probably thinks this is wrong, they should speak out. What if she had waited? What if she hadn't done anything? What if she hadn't said anything? The trajectory of the civil rights movement would have been irreparably changed had she not decided to speak out. And I say to you, there are only two decisions that distinguish her on that day and you today, and that is deciding that injustice is wrong and deciding that you're the person to do something about it. And this is important. This is critically important because We probably won't be called again to do the big things that she did in the way that she did. But each of us is called to fight injustice. Each of us is called to reject injustice. Because every day, all of us, everyone sitting here, every student, every teacher, every tech person, every day we will find ourselves on a bus. It won't be bus number 2857. It might not be a real bus, it's a metaphorical bus. But every day we will find ourselves on a bus. We'll find ourselves in a situation where we are amid injustice. We'll find ourselves on a bus. We'll find ourselves when we see things and hear things that aren't right, that we think are wrong. We'll find ourselves in the situation that Mrs. Parks was in. And the question before us is, well, what will we do? Because every day we will find ourselves on a bus. And when the bus pulls up, and when you grab your bags, and when you walk up the stairs, and when you pay your fare, and when you look over all the empty seats on the bus that day, where will you sit? What role will you play? Will any of us have the courage to play the Rosa role? Thank you.